Good evening, everyone. This is Dilip S, Head of Sales and Marketing, DQS India. First of all, thank you so much for taking our time to join us in the second program of this DQS webinar series on risk management. Now, we all know risk management is a major addition to most of the management system standards. Throughout the webinar, we endeavor to give you insights into various risk management frameworks and how it can be integrated to your existing management systems. Now, this webinar is bigger. We have around, in fact, more than 500 registrations from 17 countries covering Asia, Africa, Europe, and Australia. We've also incorporated your feedback from the last program to enhance your experiences. We hope that this time the sound and the video quality are better than the last time. The webinar has primarily three components. So this is how the webinar is structured. Number one, we would talk about, we'll give you a quick overview on about DQS Group. Then we would deep dive into risk management, its purpose, applicability, principles, framework, and processes. And finally, we would open up to the question and answers session. My request to all of you is that please post your questions in the questions tab. On the right hand side, you would see a variety of options, including chat, but please post all your questions into the question tab so that towards the end of the webinar, we can take up most of the questions. Talking about DQS Group. Yeah. So we are a global top 10 management system certification, assessment, and training organization with presence in close to over 100 plus countries. Globally, we have certified 35,000 plus clients and around 58,000 plus locations. I often say this, we are not just a certification body, but we are someone who's contributed to the evolution of the certification industry overall. Back in 2000, in the year 2000, we became the world's first certification body to get accredited for ISO TS standard, which is now known as IATF 16949. In 2006, we were pioneers again. We issued the world's first certificate of IRIS, which is into railways. Now, towards your bottom left of the screen, you see some of our major shareholders. Of course, we all know UL, which is Underwriting Laboratories, one of the world's largest product safety certification bodies. DIN, like ISO, is a standard-making body. In fact, last year they celebrated 100 years of their existence. DGQ is another major shareholder, which does a lot of training and research. And we also have industry associations as some of our minor shareholders. Now, this gives us key insights into what's happening in the ground realities of business, and whatever we deliver, be it audit, training, or assessments, the industry insights flow into this. Now, what's interesting to primarily note out here is within the same group, we have capabilities of product safety certifications or product certifications. We are also a standard making competence within the group, research and training, and of course, we do a lot of management system certifications. We're the proud founding members of IQNet. Now, for those of you who do not know what IQNet is a collection of one of the world's largest certification bodies. We are the proud founding members of it. Globally, 1 out of 3 certifications done globally are given to the members of IQNet. Coming to our services, we do certifications. Globally, we do close to around 200 plus standards across 25 industry verticals. You name any ISO certifications, we do that. Talking about our presence in some of the major industries, for example, aerospace in India, we're among the market leaders with roughly around 19% market share. Telecom, we are number 1 in India. Automotive, also we are among the market leaders globally, and we have worked with some of the leading OEMs, and roughly our market share is around 7 to 8%. And of course, we do a lot of work in IMS. IT, we have done a lot of work in terms of ISO 27000 or even ITSM. Energy management is another key area that we work on. We do a lot of assessments. It can be a gap assessment against any of the standard that you may require, or it can be a energy audit or water audit to bring down your costs on the P&L. We also do safety assessments and among other assessments. With trainings, our endeavor is to make our trainings impactable, which is bringing the measurable impact on your business. And we do close to around 300 to 400 training programs ranging from soft skills, behavioral skills, functional skills, leadership programs, and of course, we do a lot of training programs related to management system certifications. GC Mark is another premium offering of ours. The idea is to help organizations differentiate and brand their uniqueness. We have a variety of labels ranging from GC Mark for Green Company to Organization Health to Excellent Employer to Trusted Product to Verified Customer Satisfaction. We've also developed a robust supplier governance model. We work with OEMs if they have a framework available. We ensure we do assessments against that. Idea is to build quality of their supply chain. Or also we have partnered in the past with OEMs to develop a customized, tailor-made checklist, taking aspects from quality, sustainability, health and safety, among few. Now, that's broadly about the DQS group. Now, dwelling deeper into risk management, my colleague, Mr. Kumaran, who's an industry veteran with around 42 years of experience, with 18 years of experience in the industry and rest in the management system certification thing. So over to Mr. Kumaran to take you through risk management.
Very good evening. It's again a pleasure to be part of this team, a wonderful team, willing to know the topic of risk management today. Risk management is a process, and we all know that there is a standard called as the ISO 31000, and which is seen revision very recently, 2018 version. And that particular standard has been referred in all the management system standards, wherever the process related to risk assessment has been made as a requirement as part of the standard. Way back in 2012, when the ISO 22301 business continuity standard, which was launched in May 2012, and the corrected version got relaunched in June 2012, was basically focusing on this risk assessment. When we look at this risk assessment process, which has been a requirement in almost all the standards now, it indicates that organizations have to focus on understanding the risk, which is called as the business risk, and have a solution to overcome the risk. In totality, we understand this as a process of managing the risk. Business sustainability is the most important requirement for any business entity. In order to sustain the business, it is essential for organizations to understand what are the various risks that are part and parcel of the system, and how do we handle or manage these risks. So when we are looking at the risk assessment process, standards like ISO 9001 emphasizes on risk-based thinking. Though the standard per se does not explicitly talk about risk assessment, but risk-based thinking is the basic concept which is required by organizations to ensure that it becomes an organizational culture. When it comes to risk, it is essential to understand that it is everybody's business in an organization to look at the risk. It is very essential for organizations to look at the risk. People at different levels within an organization may be experiencing certain risk, which may be part of the product, which may be related to the process which they own and which they perform, and which may be part of the overall system. Risk has to be identified, determined, understood, and managed. The overall concept of risk-based thinking has been emphasized, as I said, in the ISO 9001 standard, which requires organizations to systematically having an approach, which is called as a process approach. We are very much aware and clear about this concept of process approach. When we look at the quality management system related risk, any risk in a QMS would eventually have an impact on the customer. So organizations have to look at what are those risks, which may be a part and parcel of the business risk, and ultimately have an impact on the customer satisfaction. As we know that in order to enhance customer satisfaction, an organization has to constantly put their efforts in terms of providing the best quality of products and services. So in order to achieve this, it is essential to understand what are the various types of risks which are present within various processes, and how do we manage those risks such that the risk does not become a barrier in terms of achieving or enhancing customer satisfaction. We all know that risk management or risk assessment, which is part and parcel of the risk management, is a proactive approach. In the earlier standard, we used to use a term called as preventive action. The preventive action, which is a proactive mechanism, which is now having a greater focus when we look at from a risk perspective. And it should become an integral part of an organizational culture. It is not one-time process, one-time job to do a risk assessment. It is an ongoing process. Changes keep happening in organization. Change of people, change of methodology, change of equipments and machineries, change of material. So whenever there is a change, there can be a possibility of risk that needs to be looked at. So as we understand that in order to ensure a sustainable business model, it is necessary that organizations understand and start the journey towards risk-based thinking, and which should become an integral part of a management system. Ensuring that the risk management process, including a risk assessment sub-process, should be a part and parcel of the management system. At times it can so happen that organizations, because of not having a clarity in terms of the importance and purpose of this risk management process, would look at that someone will take care of this particular risk related to the organization. Largely, people believe that it can be a person or a team who can conduct a risk assessment and identify and determine the various risks related to the processes, related to the system, and come out with certain conclusions based on the assessment and establish certain controls so that the risk is under control and also the risk is managed. At times, it can also happen that the organization may decide to involve a subject matter expert who may be an external person to an organization, and then would hand over the entire responsibility of conducting a risk assessment to an external resource. And if the involvement and participation of the concerned process owners or the people in the organization does not happen, possibilities are there that the identified risk may not be the appropriate risk, and at the same time, it may not help an organization to overcome the risk. It's also necessary that we know that risk is a result of an uncertainty. And we look at the severity and probability of risk when we look at a risk. It is essential to understand what is the severity of the risk and what are the probabilities of such risks occurring in an organization. And we see that organizations do have processes, procedures in order to perform this risk assessment process. Every management system standard now requires a formal risk assessment process. When we look at the automotive sector specific standard of IATF 16449, there is a specific requirement of conducting risk assessment based on certain factors, maybe the field failures, field returns, or the customer complaints, the impact on the organization related to such risk. When we look at the other standards, say for example, the environmental management system standard, it requires a risk determination with respect to the environmental impact. Similarly, when we look at the ISO 45001, which has replaced the OSHA's 18001 standard of occupational health and safety, again, we understand the importance of risk assessment. The risk related to health and safety have to be assessed in order to establish effective controls. So the purpose of determining the risk is to establish effective controls. Now, when we look at the purpose, and when we say it is an inherent, it is inherent in all aspects of a quality management system or a process or functions. So we understand that there is, as such, not even a single area where the risk is not present. The risk-based thinking ensures all such risks are identified and they are effectively controlled. When we look at the standard of ISO 9001:2015, and we understand that the standard has introduced the concept of risk and opportunities. For the users of the QMS 9001 standard specifically, the risk terminology itself was found to be new, something which we are talking new. But it is just replacing the preventive action process. The preventive action which was there right from the beginning of the standard when it was launched way back in 1987 until now, till date, when the 2015 version was launched. So the concept of risk was understood in terms of preventive action. And now, since we are talking more in terms of risk, it is essential to understand the framework. We also need to understand that the risk process has certain defined methodology. When we look at the ISO 31000 standard, it requires an organization to articulate a policy as part of their commitment towards risk management. Risk management has to be a process which is top driven and which is running across the organization, where everybody, each and every one, is taking part in this process. We know that certain risks may be identified or classified or categorized as critical risks. So in order to ensure effective planning operation of the quality management system, so the standard requires the organization to ensure the risk-based thinking. Risk management approach can be adopted for all kinds of activities. For example, it may be for the projects, for functions, for the assets, and products or activities. As we know that it will turn the strength of the organization and establish the linkages between activities, because every activity is dependent on the other activity. We know the output of one process becomes input for another process, which is the basic understanding of the process approach. So there can be a possibility that there is a risk which is passed on to the other process, which is getting an input from the previous process. Now, articulating a policy as a commitment ensures that the people in the organization understands the importance of risk management. And then articulating objectives based on the policy. As we all know that objectives have to be in line with the policy. Similarly, the risk management policy and the risk management objectives also should be in line. It should be synchronized. And then it is also essential that as part of the risk management, the required resources for an effective risk management also needs to be planned and provided. The most important part of an implementation process of risk management is the effective communication. People within the organization have to understand the importance of the risk, and it has to be communicated effectively across the organization. There has to be an approved approach with respect to communication. The right, relevant, and appropriate information related to risk management has to be communicated across the organization so that the people who are responsible for various processes and the outcome of such processes are also aware of the applicable risk and the controls associated with those risks so that the risk is managed effectively. And there also have to be a defined methodology for effective consultation. It is essential for risk management to consult the stakeholders. Right from the beginning with the process owner, and the stakeholder could also include the customer or the suppliers, the supply chain. So we need to understand that any risk at any given point of time within an organization can have an ultimate impact on the business in terms of enhancing customer satisfaction or in terms of protecting the environment when it comes to environmental management system, or in terms of prevention of injury and ill health from an occupational health and safety perspective, or in terms of ensuring business continuity when it comes to business continuity management system. So we understand that there has to be a formal mechanism. Most of the time, we only focus and address the risk assessment process alone. But risk management is a total solution for an organization. Today, we are going to quickly understand the risk management process through the ISO 9001 framework, which is following the high-level structure, which is again got introduced through the BCMS, Business Continuity Management System standard of ISO 22301, launched in 2012. So in this particular risk management understanding, we are now clear that from an ISO 9001 high-level structure framework, we look at the planning process, which is clause number 6, under which 6.1 requires organizations to ensure actions to address risk and opportunity. The moment the terminology risk and opportunity is introduced in the planning part of the standard, many times people believe that it is an independent process. It's a vertical within the quality management system, so that we identify the certain risks and we identify the opportunities, and then the process is over. there has to be a clarity in terms of understanding that the journey of an organization's business continuity has to be dependent on identifying and understanding the appropriate risk. Risk may be of different type. We understand that it is not just one-time task, as I said, to do this. Many a times it also happens through audit experiences. We understand that the people in the organization believe that since it's a requirement of the standard as part of the planning, so we have identified certain risks, we have determined certain risks, and then these are the actions we have planned in order to implement and address this risk. Let me give you a simple example to understand the importance of why risk is required to be considered and why it should become an organizational culture. For example, eating sugar could be a risk in general terms. It could be a serious risk for a person who is diabetic. It could be adding more calories for a person who is healthy, but still it has its own risk. But the severity differs from a person to person. Similarly, when we look at an organization, the risk associated to a particular process may be critical with respect to that particular process and may not be such critical or having the similar criticality or severity to another process. So each and every process have to be looked in terms of what is that risk associated with the process and how do we address this risk. And that is where the term used here is actions to address the risk. All of a sudden, actions cannot come without understanding the purpose and concept of risk. So let's quickly understand what is the principles, what are the principles which are required as part of the risk management process. The basic focus is on value creation and protection. It starts with integrate, it should be integrated. The process, entire process has to be integrated. When we say integrated, we understand that the risk management is an integral part of an organizational activities. That is where time and again we use the term it should become an organizational culture. Unless it becomes an organizational culture, it does not get integrated with the system. It continues to be a vertical. It continues to be a particular process and activity of conducting a risk assessment by a group of people within the company who may be representing the entire organization, but who may not be knowing all the possible risks related to various processes, because we know for sure it is the process owner who understands the process better than anybody else. The IATF 16949 standard also introduced the terminology process owner and also has made it as a specific requirement that process owners have to be identified by the top management and specific roles and responsibilities have to be assigned. So the importance of the process, the purpose of the process, and the output of the process, how it's going to enhance the customer satisfaction. So we understand that it has to be integrated. Then comes, it should be structured and it should be comprehensive. The risk management should be very much structured. As I said, it has to follow an approach. We know that the process approach is the best answer, and that contributes to consistent and comparable results. Consistency is very important aspect of this risk management process. At times, people may give more importance to this activity called as risk assessment, and again, it may take a backseat. There has to be a consistency, and the results are to be comparable. It has to be customized. It should be specific to the process and proportionate to the organization context and objectives. As I said, every organization is unique in itself, and every process also is unique in itself. So the risk management process has to be customized. We need to understand how to customize the process. It should be inclusive in terms of appropriate and timely involvement of stakeholders. As I said, until unless the concerned people, the relevant people, starting from the process owner, are not involved into the process, the appropriate involvement does not take place, including all other related and relevant stakeholders, the process does not become effective. It has to be dynamic. Risk management continually senses and responds to change. As I mentioned, change is something which constantly keep happening in an organization. Irrespective of the fact, the process may remain the same, the methodology may remain the same, the material may remain the same, but the people may change. The moment the change in the people happens, there's going to be an impact on the process. And the intended outcome of the process may also be impacted. So we need to understand that it should be constantly happening. It should not be static, it should be dynamic. It should also consider the best available information. In order to come to a conclusion when we conduct a risk assessment as part of the risk management process, we need to depend on data. We need to look at the historical data related to the process, the trends of the process. We need to relate it with the current information and look at what is the future expectation of that particular process, which is going to be part and parcel of the organization, and the future expectations of the customer as well as the interested parties. It also need to consider the human and cultural factors, human behaviors and cultural significance that influence risk management. Many times, people may be reluctant towards considering a risk. It may be a possibility that because of the human behavior, certain risks are neglected. So it is necessary and essential for organization to develop that human behavior and ensure that the culture, which has a significant role in terms of risk management. Continual improvement is part and parcel of the risk management process. So when we look at the holistic approach, the principle starts from the integrated approach and then ultimately ends up continual improvement. Because it's an ongoing process, risk management also needs to be continually improved based on understanding what all the areas where the improvement is required in terms of risk management. What are the scopes that needs to be looked at and what are the opportunities that needs to be taken care. So we understand that it has a very specific value creation and protection to the organization. And when you look at the framework is focused on the leadership and commitment. As I said, it is always a top-driven process. Every process, until unless it is not a top-driven process by the top management, it loses its importance. As long as the top management is supporting and demonstrating their commitment towards the risk management process, like any other management system requirements, the system does not work effectively. In order to ensure that everybody in the organization become a part and parcel of this risk management process, it is the responsibility of the top management, the leadership, to demonstrate their commitment. And then again, it starts with integration. When we say the integration at this level, we're talking about the leadership has to ensure integrating risk management with the structure and context of the organization. It has to be effectively aligned with the organization's business processes. Risk management or risk assessment cannot be a standalone process. It should be a part and parcel of the management and part and parcel of the business processes. It has to be designed in order to understand both the internal and external context of the organization. As we know that there are various internal and external contexts or issues related to an organization, which could also be a risk to an organization. When you look at the ISO 9001 framework, we understand from the class number 4, where the standard requires organizations to understand from the organizational context the issues related to internal and external. And then we are looking at class number 6, where we are talking about risk and opportunities. So we also see in the standard the linkage given in the class number 6.1 to class numbers 4.1 and 4.2. That means we are looking at the issues which are internal, which could be an internal issue or an external issue, which would turn out to be a risk to an organization, and how do we address this risk. That is how we plan in class number 6. Similarly, when we are talking about linkage, when we look at class number 8, we also get the linkage of class number 6.1. So that means class number 4.1, 6.1, and 8.1 of an ISO 9001 2015 gives us an understanding that risk which has to be looked at from a issue perspective, that which could be an internal issue or an external issue, and then address those risks as well as the opportunities, and then establish effective controls. When we say class number 8 of ISO 9001, we are talking about operation, which further drills down to operational controls. That means the ultimate purpose of risk assessment is to establish effective controls. And those effective controls will ensure the probabilities of the occurrence of any possible risk and reduce them. And that is the whole idea behind this risk assessment process. And then when it comes to implementation, as I said, class number 8.1, define an appropriate timing and approach for implementing, complying with legal and regulatory requirements. It's also essential to understand the importance of the legal obligation or the compliance obligation. The new terminology used in the standard of 2015 version of 9001 as well as 14001 is legal obligation. Legal obligations are the same, which we understand as legal and regulatory requirements. In the ISO 9001 context, we use the term statutory and regulatory requirements. So it is necessary to implement appropriate timing and approach which are in line with the legal obligation. So that the risk framework, I have to consider that the legal obligations also have an important role to play. Then comes evaluation. The next phase of the framework is called as evaluation. We need to establish performance measures and periodically measure, report, and review the performance. Then only it is possible to know whether the controls established against the risks which have been assessed are effective and are ensuring that the risk is not occurring. It's able to prevent the risk. The controls are capable of preventing a risk. And a periodical monitoring and reporting, as well as the review by the top management, will help an organization to ensure that the risk management process is effective in totality. Last but not the least, the last phase is called as the improvement phase. Based on the review and based on the results of the review, decisions can be taken in order to how to minimize the risk and ensure that the risk management framework and the policy and plan can be further improved. As we understand, this improvement is an ongoing process. That's why we also use the term continual improvement, which we saw in the principal part. And the term class number 10 of the high-level structure of the management system structure. You find it in every new standard, revised standard of QMS, EMS, as well as OHSMS and other management system standards. So it has a very specific framework. It is, again, not a standalone process. It has to follow certain principles. It has to follow certain framework. Then only it will provide us the required result. Now, slowly getting into the framework of process. The risk management also has a specific process. When we say process understanding is transformation of input into output. So we know that in order to perform a risk assessment, which is a part of the risk management process, we need to understand at the first level, we need to have the scope. What is the scope? Defining the scope for the risk management process, within which if we are only looking at the risk assessment as a requirement of the standard, and then what is the scope within which this assessment has to be made? Establish the internal and external context, which we discussed, because all those internal and external contexts, which are also understood as issues, would eventually be turning out to be a risk. And then establish risk criteria. We need to have the risk criteria so that we are able to understand, based on this criteria, we consider them as risk. We understand that communication and consultation also plays an important role of a risk management process. At each stage of the risk management process, the information has to be communicated, and necessary consultation also should take place with both the internal and external stakeholders. Most of the time, when a risk assessment is done as part of the risk management in an organization, the communication does not happen effectively. Many times, people in the organization are unaware of the risk assessment process for a simple reason: it is done by a team of experts within the organization. A group of people or a team of people who are having the competence to perform a risk assessment process does this activity, and it stays to be a layered approach. When we say layered approach, it does not percolate down the line. Many times people across the organization are not even aware of the risks associated with their processes. In spite of the fact that the organization has conducted or performed a formal risk assessment process, they have documented the identified as well as determined risks, and they also maintain many times a document called as a risk register, a common document which are found available in many organizations. But when it comes to other people in the organization, maybe a process owner is unaware of the information available in that particular document, which is a very important information for the organization. So it is essential that communication of information relevant to the risk management process need to be made effective. As part of further understanding the risk, we know that risk can be looked at as a strategic risk, number one, under which we have a couple of risks which are called as strategic risk. It could be economic risk, industry risk, strategic transition risk, social risk, technological risk, political risk, organizational risk. So these categories of risk have been grouped under strategic risk. Then comes the operational risk, starting from the environmental risk, financial risk, business continuity risk. As I said, the most important requirement of an organization to ensure the continuity of business. Any possible risk should not become a barrier for an organization that would eventually stop the business, bring the business to a halt. It cannot happen. And in order to ensure that it should not happen and it cannot happen, a business continuity plan, a business continuity process should be put in place. There can be something called as an innovation risk. Because of innovative ideas, we also need to look at, is there a risk? Commercial risk, project related risk, human resource related risk. We know that a lot many times organizations do combat this kind of risk called as risk related to human resources, the competence. related to human resource could be a big risk. Non-availability of competent human resource could be again a big risk. Health and safety related risk, again part and parcel of every organization. Just to give you an understanding, I would like to give an example of a risk, which was a real-time example witnessed by an organization, and the organization suffered a lot because of this particular problem. Now, an organization required to use potassium cyanide, which is a very harmful chemical, which is used in the electroplating process. And that process, and that organization, electroplating process, was a major activity performed as a supplier to various customer organizations. And since because it was not assessed, the risk associated with the use of potassium cyanide was not assessed effectively. One person who was a new employee of the company, who was at a helper level in the company, did not know that it was potassium cyanide because it appears similar to sugar. And unfortunately, he used that particular chemical thinking that it is sugar. And the problem was the person died in the company. Now, the company was having other issues also, which was parallelly going on. And there was a trade union presence in the company. Because of a Cold War which was existing in the company between the management and the trade union, and this became a spark which led to an unrest, employee unrest, which turned out to be a strike and ultimately ended up as a lockout for the company. And the company never again started. This is not a story, it's a fact. Now it is necessary to understand what was the root cause. The root cause was use of potassium cyanide, and it was not under appropriate control. There was no control related to the use of this particular chemical. And had the company done a risk assessment related to the use of this particular harmful chemical, probabilities are there that they would have established effective controls, appropriate and effective controls, which would have taken care of many problems, including this particular problem. It was an innocent act of a person who was not aware of the problem, and it led to a greater consequences, which was, detrimental to the business of the company. The business continuity was at stake. The company never started again. Now, why do we understand? Why do we want to look at this? All that health and safety related risk also have to be looked at micro level. Most of the time, when the risk assessment is looked at, people in the organization have a common understanding that this is a requirement of the standard, that we need to conduct a risk assessment related to these areas because the standard requires these things to be done. So we are doing it. Rather, the understanding has to be the other way, that the risk, any possible risk in an organization is a problem to an organization. That's where when we look at the principle and when we understand, it has to be an organizational culture. A risk management should be an organizational culture. So moving on, then there could be possibility of a property risk, a reputation risk. So these are all categorized under operational risk. Then reporting risk. Information risk and reporting risk. Many times risks are not reported. People do not have A, the clarity, B, the involvement in terms of reporting a risk. Information about risk is not clear. The reporting mechanism is not there, or it is not clear, or it is not known. So the risks are not reported. Then comes the compliance risk. As we understand, the law requires risk related to legal requirements. Any non-fulfillment of a compliance obligation, a legal requirement, could be a big risk to an organization. Then there could be a control risk and professional risk. Right. These are some of the categories which are part and parcel of the risk. The purpose of understanding this is to ensure that whenever we perform a risk assessment, which is a part of risk management, we need to understand and look at all these possible risks, starting from a strategic risk, operational risk, reporting risk, and compliance risk. Moving on, risk assessment. As part of risk assessment, the first step is to identify the risk, followed by analyzing the risk and then evaluating the risk. When we say risk identification, the process is to find, recognize, and describe the risk that is affecting the organization achieving its objective. Every organization has certain specific objectives that are met, needs to be met. And in order to achieve that, it is necessary that what are those risks which act as a barrier from achieving the organizational objective. So we need to identify them, followed by a risk analysis. Risk analysis involves consideration of causes and sources of risk. It is essential to understand the source of risk and then the causes, the positive and negative consequences. So this also gives an understanding. Risk always does not mean negative. There could be positive consequence as well. The likelihood and those consequences can occur. The possibilities of such risk occurring or the recurrence should be looked at. Then it has to be evaluated. The risk has to be evaluated to assist the decision making, because based on the analysis, the purpose of analysis is to come out with certain decisions. We need to make certain decisions. And in order to make such decisions based on the outcome of the risk analysis, that which risk needs what type of treatment and the priority of treatment when it comes to implementation. You need to have a prioritization of which risk has to be attended or addressed first, and what is the treatment and how we go about in terms of implementation. Many times it can so happen that it may be not that difficult to assess a risk and to come to a conclusion, but it becomes a challenge when it comes to implementation. So it is necessary to understand the importance. Then comes the risk treatment process. It may be a possibility that an organization may end up in selecting one or more options for modifying a risk and implementing the actions. Probable options could be, if possible, avoid or eliminate the risk. Even the hierarchy of controls in the OHS management system or environmental management system, the first option is to eliminate, avoid. Then the next option could be taking or increasing the risk in order to pursue an opportunity. Remove the source of risk. As long as the source is not removed, the risk is going to be existing. So if it is possible, remove the source. Changing the likelihood or consequence could be a possibility, could be an option. Transfer the risk or share the risk also could be an option. Sorry. Last but not the least, if an organization has decided, it's called as an informed decision, risk-based informed decision, it can decide to continue with that risk, which is called as an acceptable risk, or retain the risk, so that we do not want to do anything, we do not implement any action because that does not have any severe impact on my business, severe impact on the outcome of my business. So I continue to live with this risk. So that is also an option. As we understand that once the controls are implemented, it needs to be monitored and reviewed on periodical basis. When we say monitoring also again an ongoing process. Every control has to be monitored on an ongoing basis in order to check and ensure that the controls are able, capable, reliable, and in an event of a control going out of control, we are able to track it and take actions immediately. So monitoring helps possibility of out of control situations, because out of control situation is again a risk. detecting and changing the internal and external context, recording and reporting, as we said, communicating risk and outcomes, provide information for decision making, improve risk management activities, assist interaction with stakeholders. It is also very important to have an effective interaction with the concerned stakeholder. It may be beginning from the very basic, the process owner, who is the stakeholder. The business continuity management system model, for an example, is shown here in order to understand the importance. It again follows the very basic PDCA model, which every management system standard follows. It starts with establishing, which is a plan, implementing, which is part of do, monitor and review, which is check, maintain and improve, which is an act mechanism, which falls under the framework of PDCA. And we get inputs from the interested parties. Interested party could be a customer, interested party could be an environmental requirement or health and safety requirement. And all these requirements are nothing but business continuity requirements. And then the output also goes to the same interested parties, or the requirements of business continuity is converted into managed business continuity. That means business continuity is in short managed. And during this entire process of PDCA, the continual improvement of the business continuity or any management system continuity keeps on happening. That is how we see this generic framework, which is applicable to any management system and the processes or the requirements which are part of the management system. Now, a simple risk management table is shown here, just to give an understanding. Supposing a supplier initial approval related issues are identified, risks are identified, right? Risk identified, say for example, supplier financial stability, if that is a risk and it has been rated as high risk, in terms of severity, and then probability is low, but the risk rating, which is the multiple of severity and probability, indicates that it is high. And presently, current control, no control is available. So I'm talking about the third row. And where action to reduce or eliminate the risk could be supplier financial due diligence audit. That means as an organization, you perform or you conduct a due diligence audit, which will help you to understand the financial stability of the supplier, because that information may not be available with the company during the initial approval process. So just to understand in a simpler term, so this is something as an example, as a specimen we can consider. And please remember, every organization will come out with their own methodology. That's why, as part of the framework, we understand that it has to be customized. It cannot be one standard mechanism or method. It has to be customized. So that brings us to the end of keeping time into consideration. We are coming to the end of the session, and we now enter into the question and answer. Mr. Dilip.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Kumaran, for your wonderful insights on risk management. Uh, uh, Good evening, everyone, and we have tons of questions flowing from all across the globe. Given the paucity of time, we'll pick and choose few to start with. So the first question is from Mr. Anil Chopra, and the question is, risk needs to be covered for all the processes and departments, or is there some specific sections or any standard where the risk assessment needs to be applied?
Well, when we talk about the specific standard, all the management system standards refer the ISO 31000 standard to be used as a reference document, which gives us the requirement with the framework of the risk assessment. And now the question is, do we have to identify all the risk? Again, it is the organization who has to decide based on the business requirement, because every organization will have to identify, first of all, based on the policy and objective, they have to decide the scope, the boundary, to what extent we need to identify the risk, and what all the processes and activities which would come under this boundary need to be decided by the organization. So the term all may not be an appropriate term to be used.
Sure. The next question is from Mr. Vipul Kumar, and the question is how to monitor risk assessment.
Well, monitoring risk assessment is based on the decisions or first of all, the inference of the analysis. When you do a risk assessment, you conduct an analysis and then you get an inference of analysis, which is nothing but the conclusion or decision. And based on the decision, you would implement certain controls. And monitoring is simply that we are monitoring the controls implemented based on the assessment. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Kumaran, on this. Kanika from Pune is asking, as per ISO 9001, is there a need for documentation of risk management, formal documentation of risk management?
Well, a very good question indeed. Now, as of now, ISO 9001, when we look at the ISO 9001, the standard does not use the term risk management. The standard does not use the term risk assessment. The standard only uses the term address the risk and opportunities, right? So certainly it's needed to have documented information that can be maintained in order to demonstrate the compliance to this requirement.
Yeah. Amit from Delhi is asking, we are a manufacturer of metal sheet supplying to auto OEMs. We are having around 100 plus employees, and we have 5 management team members who are hands-on, who interact with us on a day-to-day. There are regular shop floor meetings which happen. In this case, where the top management is involved so much into the business, is the risk management requirement applicability still there?
In spite of the fact that the involvement of the concerned people, including the top management, is effective and it is in place, risk management helps, or risk assessment will only help in order to identify the potential risk. The actual risk may be known to the company, but the potential risk have to be looked at. Until a process is in place, it may not be possible to understand the potential risk. So the answer is yes, definitely you need to have a formal system of identifying the potential risk, though the actual risk may be known. And as you said, all the people, the concerned people are part and parcel of the business, including the top management's effective involvement.
Another category of questions which are flowing in from a couple of people is if organization is ISO 27001 certified, is it required to go for ISO 30,000 requirements by Arun Kumar? And a similar question is from Sunita from Hyderabad as well.
Well, having certified to a particular standard, including 22301 or 270001, does not mean that reference to ISO 31001 is not needed. As I said, all these standards refer the use of ISO 31001, which gives a clarity in terms of the risk management process, the framework. Just now we talked about the principles, framework, and the process itself. So it's good to use the 31,000 standard, in spite of the fact that the company's systems are certified to different standards like 22301 or 27001. Yep.
Mr. Senthu Raman is asking how to assess opportunity.
A good question. Opportunities are the solutions for the risks which have been identified. If we can call in a simple term a risk as a problem, opportunity could be an answer, right? Supposing if a risk identified as lack of competence of human resource is a risk, then the opportunity is to train the people. So training could become an opportunity in order to overcome the risk. So many times you find the opportunity which acts as a solution or an answer to your problem or question or a risk.
A very interesting question coming from Mr. Rao. As the approach of risk management should be top-down approach and should be integrated with organization process and systems. The realistic challenge is quality managers reporting to operational people or management who may have a limited knowledge about risk management and its understanding. The QA department cannot create a buy-in with them to perform risk management and implement controls. Is DQS planning to initiate or conduct awareness session to CEOs and MD level stakeholders in India?
Well, very interesting question, as well as an eye opener to the industry. Let me say that as we understand that the risk management has to be an organizational culture where each and everybody becomes part and parcel, and it's everybody's business when it comes to risk. And now coming to conducting awareness or seminars or workshop, certainly yes, if that is the need of the industry, yes, definitely DQS would be the first to address that.
Just to add to Mr. Kumaran, Mr. Rao, DQS does exclusive leadership programs, and we have done in the past, programs of awareness on risk management for top management. Typically, these programs range for 4 to 5 hours, or it can be also extended to 1 day. We keep that short because of the paucity of time the management may have. So the answer is yes, we do conduct programs specifically for CEOs and MD levels. Next question coming up from CBS. Standards like QMS and OSHA's already address risk assessment and control measures, deviation and critical process control parameters, legal requirements, etc. Are they same as the risk management we are discussing?
Certainly, yes. These requirements of these standards are part and parcel of the risk management process. So when we talk of risk management, all these requirements on from the various standards are also focusing on the risk assessment, which helps in risk management. Certainly, yes.
A very similar question from Sherwin from Durban. Our organization is already certified for ISO TS. We are in the process to upgrade to IATF 16949. Is the PFMEA or DFMEA meets the requirements of risk management?
Yes, of course. FMEA, failure mode effect analysis, is the wonderful tool and which is a part of the risk assessment process. Whether it is process FMEA or a design FMEA, certainly yes, it is an effective tool for risk assessment process.
Okay.
Yeah.
The next question coming from Pranav Shah, is there a risk assessment format? Do we have identified the criteria for the mitigation and assessment of risk? Combining this with another question from Sunita, do you have the specific guidelines from where we can refer to about the risk management?
Well, to begin with, I would suggest that please go through the standard of ISO 31000 2018 version, and which will give you a lot of insight about the risk management process. And further, if you need more assistance, feel free to contact DQS.
Right. Somebody is asking, could you give us specific examples of risk having positive consequences?
Well, positive consequences, just as an example, compliance obligation is a requirement for any business entity, irrespective of not even having a formal management system. Any organization is having a compliance obligation, that is compliance to the law of the land. Effective compliance and timely compliance is a positive indicator, right? So that there are certain conditions in terms of compliance obligations. If those conditions are effectively complied, so it's a positive aspect of a risk.
Sure. What is the difference between risk and issue?
Well, the standard of 9001 to start with, has talked about issues which are coming under 4.1, internal issues and external issues, and in continuation, linkage given to 6.1, where we talk about risk and opportunity. So, say for example, lack of competent human resource, if it is an internal issue, it also could be a risk. So, lack of competent human resource is again a risk. So it is in relationship between the issues and risk. So you don't have to separately look for a risk. Everything which may be emerging out of the issues, maybe an internal issue or an external issue. Say for example, as an external issue, the supplier non-performance as an external issue could be a risk to an organization. So that's how we understand the issue and the risk. That is how the standard also has established a linkage between 4.1 and 6.1, where 4.1 talks about issues, 6.1 talks about risk.
The next question is, can risk be scored? Is there any acceptable risk score? A similar question is how to evaluate risk in numbers or statistically. Another question flowing in is there any software tools available for doing this? So people are basically asking questions, can there be a risk score? Can it be evaluated, measured?
Of course, yes. See, risk assessment, there are methodologies, there are processes based on which risk assessment can be done. And then when it comes to software, definitely yes, there are customized softwares which are available, or every organization, as the risk management is a customized process, you need to look at the solutions in terms of software. You need to get a customized software for the kind of risk associated to your company. So that is possible.
The next question flowing in from Mr. Giridhara. Dear sir, what is the difference between mitigation action for risk and contingency action?
Contingency action or a contingency plan is an alternate arrangement. Okay, it's a plan B arrangement. And when it comes to mitigation action, when there is a risk, what is the action that will mitigate that particular risk, right? Contingency action also is a type of a mitigation, action.
Adding to the same question, can identified risks be closed after taking mitigation action?
Depending upon the type of risk. It's a very generic question. I cannot say an yes or no answer. Depending upon the type of the risk and the severity of the risk, the closure needs to be looked at.
Another question from I think, if we have done a risk analysis, but during the audit, auditor finds some risks have been missed out, will this be treated as a OFI or an NC? Right.
Good question. Now, based on the auditing requirement, if all the risks which are relevant to the organization and the auditor has an evidence to demonstrate that non-identification of a particular risk or certain risks have led to a certain failures or a system breakdown, so definitely it would be considered as a non-conformity based on the audit evidence. So I just cannot give a generic yes or no without knowing the evidence.
Also, just to add to Mr. Kumaran, I think it also would depend on the risks have been missed out for which critical for which process. If it's a critical process, maybe it can be lead to non-conformity.
Non-conformity, yeah, of course, yes. Sure. That's what, if the audit evidence clearly indicates that non-identification of a particular risk has led to a failure, certainly yes, it's a non-conformity.
With respect to ISO 9001, we're actually already crossed time by 7.5 minutes, but we'll take few last questions. With respect to ISO 9001, is it necessary to link issues with the risks?
Definitely, yes. That is what the standard also clearly gives the linkage. As I mentioned, I repeat it again. Class number 6.1 gives the linkage of 4.1 and 4.2. Class number 8.1 gives a linkage of class number 6.1. That means there is a linkage between these three classes of 4.1, 6.1, and 8.1.
Sure. The next question talks about, is there any approach for addressing residual risk?
Well, residual risk, depending upon what is the severity of that particular residual risk, the approach may differ, because many times the organization may consider that residual risk as an acceptable risk level. But for another company, the residual risk may have severe implication or impact. So it depends upon the type of that residual risk.
Maybe the last few questions. Is there any provision in ISO to control the risk related to leadership change management to be monitored and controlled?
Well, interesting question, but the answer lies within the standard of ISO 9001, class number 5.1, the leadership commitment. Irrespective of the change of the leadership, any leadership which is responsible for the organization has to comply to the 5.1 requirement, which talks about leadership and commitment.
The next question is whether risk management to be defined as per the standard requirement, or it can be as per the company requirement can be defined.
It's a combination of both. First of all, the company prerogative or the company decision is first. and then supported by the risk management standard.
Okay. This is the last and final question.
Yeah.
So for those of the people whose questions have not been addressed, please feel free to reach out to us over mail or phone number. We also have the list of questions. We'll also get back to you on the same. The last question coming across is how to categorize risk rating into critical, high or low. Is there any guidelines or standard?
Certainly, yes. 31,000 ISO 31,000 standard gives you the clarity in terms of rating the risk, and there are different methodologies of rating the risk based on severity and the probabilities or occurrences. And rating can be maybe risk may be rated as a high or a medium or a low or an acceptable risk. So this is something which is decided by the organization depending upon the comfort level in terms of conducting this risk rating. So as such, there is no standard methodology which needs to be followed by all organizations. It is up to the organization to decide the methodology.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kumran, for your wonderful insights. And on behalf of DQS India and DQS Group, thank you so much, everyone, for taking out time to join us for this webinar. We are extremely overwhelmed to see the responses in terms of the people who have joined and the questions which are flowing in. We would get back to you as soon as possible, and feel free to get in touch with us. Thank you so much once again for your participation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.